On the morning of the 21st of October, 1966, a wall of black slurry moved down a Welsh hillside at over 30 kilometers an hour and buried a primary school while the children were inside it. 116 of those children died, along with 28 adults. The company responsible for the waste tip that collapsed knew it was unstable. They had been warned. They built on top of a natural spring. And in the years that followed, that same company fought the victims' families for compensation, dipped into the disaster relief fund raised by the public to pay for the cleanup costs it was legally responsible for, and was never properly held to account. That is not the worst part of this video. It is only the beginning. In this video, we are counting down 13 UK disasters that Britain covered up and has never fully explained. Industrial catastrophes, stadium tragedies, nuclear accidents, and military failures where the official story collapsed under scrutiny decades later, and where, in some cases, no one has ever been held accountable at all. Stay with me to the end, because number one is a disaster where the government did not just cover up what happened. It blamed the dead for their own deaths, and it took 30 years for the truth to surface. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. On the night of the 28th of December, 1879, a passenger train crossing the Tay-Rail Bridge in Scotland during a violent storm plunged into the river below when the central spans of the bridge collapsed beneath it. All 75 people on board were killed. The Tay Bridge had opened only 18 months earlier and had been celebrated as a triumph of Victorian engineering, the longest bridge in the world at the time. The official inquiry, led by the Board of Trade, found that the bridge had been poorly designed, badly constructed using substandard cast iron, and inadequately maintained. The bridge's chief engineer, Sir Thomas Bouch, who had been knighted for the achievement only months before the collapse, was found principally responsible. He died disgraced less than a year later. What the inquiry did not fully establish is exactly how much political and commercial pressure had been applied to fast-track construction, cut costs, and approve a design that experienced engineers had privately questioned before the collapse. Internal correspondence between the railway company and the contractors, much of which was never made public during the original inquiry, suggests that warnings about wind loading and structural integrity were raised and dismissed in the rush to open one of the most prestigious infrastructure projects in Victorian Britain. The full extent of who knew what and when has never been completely resolved. In the early hours of the 20th of August, 1989, a pleasure boat called the Marchioness, carrying partygoers on the River Thames in central London, was struck from behind by a much larger dredger called the Bowbell. The Marchioness was pushed under the water and sank within 30 seconds. 51 people drowned, many of them trapped below deck. The disaster exposed catastrophic failures in river safety regulation. There was no effective system of river traffic control on the Thames at the time. The Bowbell's lookout position was known to be inadequate, with limited visibility from the wheelhouse, a problem that had been raised in connection with previous near misses involving the same vessel and was never addressed. In the aftermath, the handling of the victims' bodies became its own scandal. Some families later discovered that the hands of their deceased relatives had been removed without consent during the identification process, ostensibly for fingerprinting purposes, and that this had not been properly explained or disclosed to the families at the time. It took until 2000, 11 years after the disaster, for a full public inquiry to be held. The inquiry found systemic failures in river safety regulation that had existed for years before the disaster and were known to the relevant authorities. The captain of the Bowbell was acquitted of failing to keep a proper lookout in 2 separate criminal trials. To this day, no individual or organisation has ever been held criminally responsible for the deaths of 51 people on the River Thames that night. In October 1957, one of the graphite-moderated nuclear reactors at the Windscale facility on the Cumbrian coast caught fire. The fire burned for 3 days. Radioactive material, including iodine 131, was released into the atmosphere and spread across the United Kingdom and into Europe. Milk from farms across a 200 square mile area around the facility was destroyed for a month because of contamination. The full official report into the disaster, prepared by Britain's leading nuclear scientist, Sir William Penney, was suppressed by Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. Macmillan personally edited the report before a reduced, less alarming version was released to the public. His stated concern was that the full report would damage Britain's international nuclear credibility at a sensitive moment in negotiations with the United States over nuclear weapons cooperation. The complete Penney report, including the sections that more directly attributed responsibility for the fire to the pressure to produce weapons-grade plutonium at the expense of safety margins, was not released to the public until 1988, 31 years after the fire. Studies conducted decades later estimated that the radioactive release may have caused dozens of additional cancer deaths in the surrounding population, though establishing direct causation for individual cases remains scientifically difficult and has never been the subject of a comprehensive compensation scheme. The reactor itself remains sealed inside the Sellafield site to this day, its full decommissioning not expected to be complete for decades. On the 15th of April, 1,989 Liverpool football supporters were fatally crushed at the Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield during an FA Cup semi-final. A 97th victim died of his injuries in 2021. 32 years later, his death formally ruled as caused by the disaster. In the immediate aftermath, South Yorkshire Police, the force responsible for managing the crowd that day, briefed journalists and politicians that the disaster had been caused by drunken, violent Liverpool fans forcing their way into the stadium without tickets. This account was published as fact by national newspapers, most notoriously The Sun, under the headline The Truth, alongside fabricated allegations that fans had urinated on police officers, stolen from the dead, and assaulted rescuers. None of this was true. The actual cause was a catastrophic failure of crowd management by the police, who opened an exit gate without adequately directing the resulting surge of fans, sending them into an already dangerously overcrowded enclosure with no means of escape. The original 1991 inquest returned a verdict of accidental death and was widely criticized as inadequate, having imposed an arbitrary cut-off time of 3:15 p.m., after which no evidence about the chances of saving lives was considered. Families campaigned for over 2 decades for the truth to be officially recognized. In 2012, an independent panel review confirmed that police had altered over 100 witness statements to remove criticism of their own conduct and had attempted to blame the victims. A second inquest in 2016, 27 years after the disaster, finally ruled that the victims had been unlawfully killed and that police failures had caused or contributed to the deaths. To date, despite this finding, no individual has been successfully prosecuted for the deaths themselves. A former match commander was tried for gross negligence, manslaughter, and acquitted in 2019. On the 6th of July, 1988, the Piper Alpha oil production platform in the North Sea, operated by Occidental Petroleum, exploded following a catastrophic failure in its maintenance and permit-to-work systems. 167 workers died, making it the deadliest offshore oil disaster in history. The explosion was triggered when a safety valve, removed for routine maintenance, was not properly logged as out of service. A night shift worker, unaware the valve was missing, restarted a pump connected to it, causing a massive gas leak that ignited within minutes. What followed exposed catastrophic failures in the platform's design and emergency response. The fire suppression system had been switched to manual mode because of divers working nearby and was never switched back. Workers were instructed to muster in an accommodation block that was not designed to withstand prolonged fire and explosion, rather than evacuate immediately, a decision that cost many of them their lives when the block was consumed by subsequent explosions. The public inquiry led by Lord Cullen found extensive and systemic failures across the platform's safety culture, communication systems, and emergency procedures, failures that the industry and its regulators had tolerated for years in the pursuit of continuous production. The Cullen inquiry led to over 100 recommendations that fundamentally reshaped North Sea safety regulation, but the question of why an industry generating enormous profits had allowed such basic safety failures to persist for so long, and why no individual executive was ever criminally prosecuted for the systemic negligence identified by the inquiry, has never been satisfactorily answered. On the 6th of July, 1988, a relief tanker driver delivering chemicals to the Lower Moor water treatment works near Camelford in Cornwall was given the wrong instructions and discharged 20 tons of aluminium sulfate directly into the treated water supply, rather than the correct storage tank. Tens of thousands of residents in the Camelford area received drinking water with aluminium concentrations up to 3,000 times the legal limit. Residents reported vomiting, mouth ulcers, skin rashes, and joint pain in the days following. Southwest Water, the company responsible, initially told residents the water was safe to drink, a position the company and government health officials maintained publicly for years despite mounting complaints. Residents who reported longer-term health effects, including memory loss and what they believed was early-onset dementia, struggled for decades to get their concerns taken seriously. A government-commissioned report in 1989 concluded there was no link between the contamination and long-term health problems, a conclusion affected residents and independent scientists have disputed ever since. It was not until 2013, 25 years later, that an inquest into the death of one local resident concluded that the contamination was a contributing factor. The first formal acknowledgement of a connection between the incident and serious long-term harm. Southwest Water was eventually fined a sum widely regarded as disproportionately small. The full long-term health consequences for the thousands exposed have never been comprehensively studied. On the 11th of May, 1985, a fire broke out in the main stand of Bradford City's Valley Parade football ground during a match, and within 4 minutes the wooden stand was completely engulfed. 56 people died. The speed of the fire's spread was later attributed to decades of accumulated rubbish beneath the old wooden stand, combined with the use of highly flammable timber and roofing material in a structure that had not been substantially updated since it was built in the 1900s. A discarded cigarette or match falling through a gap in the floorboards is believed to have ignited the debris below. What made the disaster especially devastating was that warnings about exactly this risk had been raised before. A letter sent to the football club 2 years earlier by a local solicitor specifically warned that a fire could spread rapidly through the rubbish accumulated beneath the stand and urged its removal. The warning was not acted upon. The subsequent official inquiry, led by Mr. Justice Popplewell, examined fire safety standards across British football grounds and led to significant regulatory reform. But the inquiry's findings about the specific warning that had gone unheeded at Bradford received comparatively little public attention at the time, overshadowed by the broader narrative of an unforeseeable tragedy. The football club's insurers and various parties faced civil litigation in the years that followed, but the question of individual accountability for ignoring a specific written warning about exactly the danger that killed 56 people was never resolved through criminal prosecution. On the 21st of December, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, killing all 259 people on board and 11 residents on the ground. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in British history. Libyan intelligence officer Abdelbasset al-Megrahi was convicted of the bombing in 2001 following a trial held under Scottish law at a specially convened court in the Netherlands. He was released from a Scottish prison on compassionate grounds in 2009, having been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and died in Libya in 2012, still maintaining his innocence. From the moment of his conviction, the case attracted sustained and serious criticism from legal scholars, journalists, and even some of the victims' family members, who argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that key witnesses had financial incentives to testify against him, and that alternative theories implicating other state actors had been inadequately investigated by Scottish and American authorities. A Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission investigation in 2007 found 6 grounds on which al-Megrahi's conviction might have constituted a miscarriage of justice, a finding that has never been fully tested in court because his appeal was abandoned before his release on compassionate grounds. The full intelligence files relating to the original investigation remain classified. In 2020, a second Libyan suspect was charged by American prosecutors, reopening questions about the full extent of who was involved and who has never faced justice. More than 3 decades after Lockerbie, significant portions of the full intelligence picture remain unavailable to the public, and credible doubts about the official account have never been definitively resolved. Between 1958 and 1961, the drug thalidomide was prescribed in Britain to pregnant women as a treatment for morning sickness, marketed as entirely safe. It caused severe limb deformities and other birth defects in an estimated 2,000 babies born in the UK during that period, with many more affected children dying before or shortly after birth. The drug was withdrawn in 1961 once the link to birth defects became undeniable. What followed was one of the longest corporate accountability battles in British legal history. The British distributor, Distillers Company, initially offered compensation that campaigners considered grossly inadequate. A sustained public campaign, significantly driven by investigative journalism at the Sunday Times, that was itself subject to a legal injunction preventing publication for years under contempt of court laws later ruled by the European Court of Human Rights to have violated freedom of expression, eventually forced a more substantial settlement in 1973. But the full corporate and regulatory history of how thalidomide came to market with inadequate testing, what the manufacturer knew about animal studies showing developmental risks before approval, and why British regulators did not require more rigorous testing has never been the subject of a full independent public inquiry. Survivors continued campaigning into the 21st century, eventually securing a dedicated UK government health grant in 2010. Almost 50 years after the drug was withdrawn. Between 1995 and 2002, 4 young soldiers died from gunshot wounds while stationed at Deepcut Barracks in Surrey, a training base for the Royal Logistic Corps. In each case, the Army's initial investigation concluded the deaths were self-inflicted, unrelated to conditions at the base. The families refused to accept these conclusions and began independent campaigns that uncovered a pattern of allegations from other recruits about bullying, harassment, and in some cases sexual abuse by training staff at Deepcut, allegations never properly investigated at the time. Surrey police reopened investigations in 2002 following sustained pressure from the families and media coverage. An independent review by Nicholas Blake QC in 2006 found serious failings in the Army's duty of care toward young recruits and recommended fresh inquests for all 4 deaths. New inquests were eventually held decades later, with mixed findings that in some instances supported and in others complicated the original conclusions. The families have continued to argue that the full truth about what happened to their children at Deepcut has never been properly established, and that the Ministry of Defence's institutional resistance to scrutiny significantly delayed any chance of establishing the truth while evidence was still fresh. On the 22nd of May 2017, a suicide bomber detonated an explosive device in the foyer of Manchester Arena immediately after an Ariana Grande concert, killing 22 people, many of them children and teenagers, and injuring hundreds more. A public inquiry led by Sir John Saunders examined not just the attack itself, but the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. The inquiry's findings, published between 2021 and 2023, revealed that the bomber, Salman Abedi, had been known to MI5 prior to the attack, that intelligence about his activities had been assessed but not acted upon with sufficient urgency, and that security at the arena itself was inadequate, with the private security contractor responsible for the foyer failing to properly investigate a member of the public who had specifically reported the bomber as suspicious moments before the attack. The inquiry found there was a realistic possibility the attack could have been prevented if MI5 had acted differently on the intelligence it held, an extraordinarily rare admission from the British security establishment. Despite the inquiry's findings, the full intelligence file on what exactly was known about Abidi, when and why specific assessments were made, remains classified for national security reasons. The families of the victims have continued to press for full transparency, arguing that lessons cannot be properly learned while significant parts of the record remain hidden from public view.